All right, y'all, we are back today with another episode of Meet Your Maker, where we are focusing on horror creators, their words, their worlds, and what they give us as makers. So today, I am incredibly excited to be joined by one of my favorite authors. This is an incredible joy for me, for sure. John Langan. His work spans a lot of different things, from short stories to novels. I came across your work, John, for the first time reading The Fisherman, and I was kind of getting into stuff through Lovecraft, and so The Fisherman really kind of hit that sweet spot for me. Would love to talk about The Fisherman for a minute, but you've got a new one coming out called Lost in the Dark. These are short stories. The title story is something that I really loved, and I want to talk about that. But John, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us for Horror Joy and Meet Your Maker. And apologies that Jeff is not going to be able to join us for this one, so you are stuck with me. But thank you for being here with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And have no fears, my vengeance will fall on Jeff.
I sure hope so. He deserves it.
He deserves vengeance. Yeah.
There's going to be a time when he's going to have to get his comeuppance, I think. So, this is Meet Your Maker. We want to meet you, talk about the worlds you've made, but this is also a Horror Joy series, and we are interested in this question about the relationship between joy and horror. It's something that I've certainly experienced, and it seems like it resonates with other people, and I'm just curious if it resonates with you. What do you think about the relationship between joy and horror?
Absolutely. I absolutely think there's a relationship there. Obviously, in the run-up to today's podcast, I've been thinking about that and asking myself, well, what is it? Because I think to myself, if there is no relationship between horror and joy, then what are we doing? If we're not enjoying ourselves, if we're not getting some kind of delight out of the things that we're reading and the things that we're watching, then why are we doing them? I don't like to suffer. I'm not a masochist. So I think that there has to be some relationship between them. And I think my kind of, what would you call it, sort of first response gut feeling is that, joy is this overwhelming emotion, as I understand it, as I conceive of it, I suppose. Joy is a little bit different from happiness. They're related, I think, but joy strikes me as just this overwhelming kind of emotion. And in that regard, horror, or the emotions that we associate with horror fiction, terror, horror, whatever, dread, also strike me as overwhelming emotions. They're these things that just are excessive. And, quite often at the end of a particularly intense, let's just talk about horror film, because everybody knows horror film. So when we think about a film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, say, which is just, it just takes nothing back. It just goes all the way. At the end of a film like that, you feel drained, you feel exhausted, at least I do. But there's also this kind of sense of joy, like, holy cow, look at what I just saw. Look at how crazy that was. And there's this kind of joy I feel when you encounter a work of art that is just so totally its own thing and does not apologize for what it is, that has a certain kind of integrity to its making. I think that evokes in me this feeling of joy.
I really like what you're saying, because it's like the emotional connection to the piece of art. It's bringing something out of you. Sometimes that's disgust, fear, maybe anger, but it's also joy, right? I love the kind of connection you made with overwhelming sense of joy, and maybe even of fear and horror and that kind of stuff too. I think all of that makes sense. I love that distinction. As a philosopher, distinctions are the thing that I love the most. And so I think making that distinction is really helpful. I started thinking about joy and horror and this podcast in particular when I started looking at one, myself, and like, hey, what's this deal? Why do I feel so much joy when I watch this stuff? But two, looking at the horror community. I started meeting people. I met Paul Tremblay in Rhode Island, got to speak to him, and Phil Gillette, who it seems like, because of the story I just read, mentions him very briefly. We've had him on the show too. But also at conventions and different things, it just seems like there's a sense in which there's joy in the horror community. You seem pretty connected with folks there, have cool friendships with other horror authors. And I'm curious if the joy aspect is communal, or is at least magnified by the community of people doing this kind of thing together. And just what your experiences with the horror community have been like in terms of joy and horror, just generally.
I absolutely find for myself personally joy in hanging out with even just one or two friends like Paul or Michael Sisko or Phil, and there's a larger scale joy that you find in larger gatherings. So I was just at StokerCon a few weeks ago, which is the convention that's built around the Bram Stoker Awards and has really emerged as the sort of leading horror convention, leading yearly horror convention. I think that Necronomicon Providence, which happens every other year, is a strong contender for that title as well. But regardless, in these events, you have a lot of writers brought together with a lot of fans, with a lot of readers. And of course, any good writer is also a good reader. So you have all of these people coming together, and there's a real, I think, palpable sense of joy in being together with your friends, with what Joe R. Lansdale calls your tribe, the people with whom you identify and with whom you feel this close sense of kinship. And I think, maybe it's because we're all weird together. You don't have to apologize for what you like and who you are and what you're interested in. And because of that, there's a way in which you can be more at ease with everybody. Yeah, I think that joy extends beyond my experience of the work, whether fiction, film, what have you. It extends beyond that to the community.
The idea that you can build something together with people that are weird in the same way as you are weird, it just makes you feel comfortable. And I think one thing that I found, and speaking with people like Paul, like Eric LaRocca, it seems as though there's something strangely inviting about the horror community that people that are not in it just kind of don't get to see. And that's part of the project, is highlighting that the joy here is that, this is not built on people who are kind of, harboring murderous fantasies. There's a joyful kind of sense of community here that I think is really, really nice. And just kind of, it's fun to see and interesting to kind of talk to people in it. I'm going to ask you a few questions about The Fisherman, but I'm going to keep those for a little bit later because I want to talk about your new short story collection, Lost in the Dark. This is coming out August 5th?
Yep, August 5th from Word Horde.
Okay. August 5th, Word Horde. I want to talk to you about that too, because I follow them. Want to see if you have insights about your experience with them. Seems like a cool thing that they have going on. But Lost in the Dark, a fantastic collection. I, this morning, read the titular story, Lost in the Dark, and it's so much fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I love this feeling of being lost. There's something about the sense of lostness that you pull at, but you pull at it in lots of different ways. Now, this story in particular, you're a character in it. And I'm curious why you decided to make yourself kind of a character in the story itself.
I think there were a couple of different answers to that. I mean, one was that the conceit of the story was to have a found footage horror film, which is in fact a kind of reworking of an actual horror or a documentary about a horrific event, a supernaturally horrific event. And I, at some point, I honestly don't quite remember what the prompt was for me now, but it just had occurred to me, found footage was so big, think post Blair Witch Project, right? And I thought, what if one of those was actually real and just no one would believe it? So you just passed it off as, oh yeah, that's just a horror movie, And so that, sort of eliding the distance between the fictional and the real, it seemed that like including myself as a character or a version of myself as a character in my little invented town of Huguenot, which is to some degree, it's the local community of New Paltz, but with enough differences to allow me to move things around and sort of not be constrained by the real geography and things like that. So anyway, including myself or a version of myself in a story like that just seemed like a kind of a cool way to give it an additional layer of that kind of metafictive reflectiveness or self-reflectiveness.
I think it works. I think part of what it does for me as a reader, and I hope this works for other people, is that it kind of just plays with that veil. Like you're talking about with found footage, there feels like this kind of veil between reality and the fictional world. And there's this kind of, we travel back and forth, and you as the narrator really kind of makes that veil unclear. And it's a very cool thing that you're doing there. Are you a big found footage horror film fan? Do you watch a lot of found footage films? Is that something that you like?
I would say you kind of couldn't avoid them over the last couple decades. I actually didn't see Blair Witch in the theaters. I saw it on video, but my wife and I were living in a very tiny house in the middle of a big piece of property. And when we finished watching it, it was very dark outside, and I really felt that darkness. I felt the sort of almost the weight of that darkness, the length of it, the breadth of it, the depth of it, and then after that, a film like Session 9, which is one of my favorite films, makes particularly brilliant use of the found footage technique. I mean, if you've seen the Spanish films, the Rec series, the first one of those in particular, first and second, I think, really do the found footage thing. I think when you get to the third does, I think the third and the fourth do as well, although the fourth, I feel like it's strained a little bit more. But nonetheless, there have been some really extraordinary found footage films. And I think also in terms of literature, Gemma Files wrote a story. Actually, I think she co-wrote it with her husband, Stephen Berlinger, called Everything I Show You Is a Piece of My Death, which plays with found footage. And Michael Wehunt, a younger writer, has a novel coming out called The October Film Haunt, which is a development from an earlier story that Michael wrote, which makes use of film and film footage, I guess I would say. So yeah, I think it's there. I think I as a writer, I saw it as a technical challenge to try to compose, how do you write about a found footage piece in a way that is hopefully effective. So yeah, like I'm happy to have done it, and I have a few other ideas, but it's also something that, I don't know, I'm interested in trying other things, I guess.
So Gemma Files, I was nodding because I thought you were going to go with experimental film, which is not quite a found footage format, but it definitely kind of talks about the bad relationship between documentary kind of stuff and...
Yeah, absolutely. You should always mention Gemma. And, honestly, I mean, again, and not exactly found footage, but Paul Tremblay's recent horror movie also fits, I think, in this. If we sort of make the tent a little bit bigger, I think both Gemma and Paul's books fit there really nicely.
I was actually going to go to Paul's book, which, for those of you listening, you don't know this book, it's called Horror Movie. It's an interesting take on horror films, and it's really quite well done. You and Paul are friends. This struck me as kind of similar to Horror Movie in it goes in a very different direction. It's doing very different things, but I just didn't know if there was behind the scenes some kind of, not competition, but hey, you did this thing, let me see if I can do it too, or let me see if I can one up you. I don't know who wrote one first or sent off drafts to the other one first, if you did that, if you share them.
Right,
but is there
right.
any kind of friendly, like, hey, let's play around with this thing and see who can do it better?
It's funny, we tend to do that more with each other as characters. So we've each written stories that use the other as characters in those stories. And I think there's a general sense in which, we read each other's work and we're very much aware of each other's work, but for that reason, we're almost more careful about not wanting to do what the other person did, at least not too soon. Lost in the Dark was published originally back in 2017. So, 8 years ago, the Horror Movie was just out this past year. So I think that if there was any way in which it had any kind of impact on Paul, it would have been very kind of remote. And there have been so many other books about and stories about horror films that I would guess that Paul was, as much as anything, responding to them.
I mean, it's a fun space. It's a fun space to be in for me as a reader, I think for other audiences. And again, this is doing something very different than a lot of even what Gemma Files is doing, what Paul was doing, what some other people have done. It's very cool, and it was just a satisfying story. I want to talk just really quickly about Word Horde. I've been following them for a long time, so I got into maybe weird fiction. I don't know. I think my brother-in-law handed me a copy of like an old Lovecraft thing, and I was like, "What is this?" And since have started this thing called the Society for the Study of the Eco Weird, we had a book come out in March of this year.
Nice.
But because of that, weird fiction has been kind of a thing, and I've found Word Horde, just following them, watching what they do. It seems like a very cool curation of books. And they're in Petaluma, California. Wanted to get out there. My brother was in San Jose for a while, and I visited him. Couldn't make it out, but just wanted to know what the experience has been like working with them. They, again, in terms of an audience, I feel like I trust their style and their taste. And you publishing with them makes so much sense because it just feels like that trust is amplified by the relationship between your work and what they're doing. So curious if you have thoughts, insights about Word Horde, because it seems like such a cool thing.
It is. Ross has been great to work with. We had worked together on my first novel, which was called House of Windows, which was published by Nightshade Publishing when they were an independent press. And Ross was a kind of assistant manager for them, but in a way was really the guy that made the whole thing work. And after Nightshade folded, and Ross decided to start his own imprint, his own publishing company, I think he learned a lot from the mistakes, to be frank, that Nightshade made. And so he publishes a limited number of books every year. You know, it's somewhere around half a dozen, between 4 and 6. He has had some illness and some personal things in his family the last year or two that have kind of hampered his production schedule, but that's ramping up again. So he doesn't overcommit himself. And the books that he publishes, he promotes, and you know, and pretty much anything I've asked Ross to do, he's done, which is nice. You know, when we really started working together almost by accident in that when I finished The Fisherman, my agent sent it around and nobody was interested. Nobody was biting. And it got to the point that I thought, man, is this book, you know, I thought this was okay. So I sent it to Ross. Just, you know, I said, look, I'm just asking you, would you just read this and tell me if it's any good, you know? And he, within a day, he wrote back and said, look, I really want to publish this. And so we went with him. And yeah, since that time, it's just made sense to continue the relationship. So we'll have, he's bringing out Lost in the Dark next month. And then I hope next year, depending on me, really, we'll be bringing out a new novel called The Cleaving Stone, which is it's sort of set in the same kind of general cosmos as The Fisherman. I can't call it a sequel exactly, but there's some overlap.
That's really exciting to hear. I love that you mentioned The Fisherman, because I just wanted to get in a quick question about The Fisherman. Like I said, it's my first interaction with your work, and I just loved it. I think going back to that weird fiction hook, as it were, I wanted aquatic weird fiction, and you offered that in The Fisherman, and it's such a incredible book. It's wild to think that nobody wanted to publish it to me, because it weaves together so many different kinds of things that are going on. One thing, I was actually rereading it for this conversation. It struck me a little bit that it's got a little bit of a kind of color out of space in it. Is that something that you were thinking about, just in terms of, so again, if you all are not familiar with this book, it's worth it. Grab it, read it. You will love it. There's like a frame story. We're introduced to a guy who has lost his wife, but then it goes kind of deeper. You go back and you get a different story about the space and the mythology. And that's where I think I thought, oh, this feels in part color out of space. Just curious if that was in the background at all, or if I'm wildly off here.
No, you know, the thing is that on the one hand, I think, well, not consciously, but then I also think, you know, I came to Lovecraft later than most people. I was in my late teens, early 20s. And so I didn't have that kind of road to Damascus experience that a lot of people have with Lovecraft when they're younger, you know? Ramsey Campbell talks about it. Stephen King talks about it. But I was really interested in him, initially in a kind of a literary critical sense. and I wrote about 180 pages when I was still pursuing a PhD. I wrote about 180 pages of this study of the relationship between Lovecraft's fiction and Robert Browning's great poem "Child Roll Unto the Dark Tower Came," and it involved me doing a lot of work on The Color Out of Space and reading that story very, very closely and very, very attentively. So it would not surprise me to find that it's there, that it's in the background. I have a pet theory that the reservoir that Lovecraft refers to, which a lot of people identify as the Quabbin Reservoir, I think it is in Massachusetts, that was actually years away from completion, as I recall at the time he wrote the story. But he had made a trip to upstate New York in which he had visited the pretty close. I think he did actually visit the Ashokan Reservoir, and I have a theory that may be what sort of set his mind going. So it would be completely appropriate for me returning to, or writing about the reservoir to in some way be channeling or whatever, or for there to be some kind of layer in there where you think, oh, this sounds kind of like The Color Out of Space. I would say, yeah, sure, why not?
Again, I certainly don't mean to imply that this is derivative or
No. I think that we should own our influences. I think that we should be proud of them. And I think the question is, right, are you writing just, pastiche, or are you doing something more with this? So, I would hope I wasn't writing pastiche, but if somebody says, hey, I find this and that in there, that's great. That's awesome.
No, I do not think that. There's a lot of Lovecraft pastiche out there. The Fisherman is not that. If you all have not heard of The Fisherman and are looking for some good, weird horror fiction, this is the one that really caught me, as it were, and just love it. I mean, the way that you weave together the stories. The same thing with The Lost in the Dark. There's a lot of weaving together of different kinds of narratives, which for me is really amazing as an audience. I love your titles. You've got another story collection called The Wide Carnivorous Sky and Other Monstrous Geographies, one called Corpse Mouth and Other Autobiographies. I mean, like, if you were to just leave a trail of titles, I think that would be enough for me to just be, that's enough. Like the top of the list for title makers. Incredibly well done.
Well, thank you. When I first started out, my good friend Laird Barron just had these amazing titles. He still does, but Hallucigenia, The Carrion Gods in their Heaven, I think it is. Like, he just had these Procession of the Black Sloth, and I used to think, damn, I would love to be able to come up with titles that were the approaching as good as Laird's are. And so if I feel that I've gotten better, I'm quite pleased.
I mean, I think definitely reaching those heights for sure. I imagine you're a fairly, I don't know, voracious is the right word, but a consumer of horror fiction, film, maybe games, I'm not sure. But I am curious about anything that you have read, watched, played recently that has certainly sparked joy relating to that connection, right, with horror.
Well, my goodness, yeah, the horror, I mean, it's become a cliche at this point to say, oh, we're living through a new golden age or what have you. But something's going on. There are these amazing films, amazing novels and story collections. I don't really play video games. It's just something I missed. I think I was just a little bit too old. For me, whenever people talk about video games, I'm like, you mean like Space Invaders? And they're like, oh, go back to the home, Grandpa. So I can't speak to video games, but in terms of books, man, you mentioned Eric LaRocca earlier, and with whom as it turns out, I share a birthday, which is a wonderfully fortuitous thing. Eric I gave him a blurb for his forthcoming novel. And in general, Eric is he's a mighty, mighty talent and just incredibly productive. He just does such great work. Rachel Harrison's novels are really wonderful. I think of her as part of a group of writers that would include like Clay McLeod Chapman and Nat Cassidy and probably Molly Polig as well, just off the top of my head, all of whom are doing amazing work. I think her novels are particularly strong. Haley Piper is a beast of a writer who just continues. Haley kind of reminds me of Eric in terms of really at the more imaginative, transgressive side of things. Maybe not imaginative, that's not quite that fantastical side of things. But, just off the top of my head, among, sort of younger writers, if you will, Laurel Hightower, too. Laurel Hightower is a beautiful, beautiful prose stylist who writes these really, really fierce stories. I think, among my own people I think of as like in my own age group, I mean, obviously, Stephen Graham Jones has yet another novel coming out. And he is as productive as he is talented, which is really saying something. Tanana Reeve Dew's recent novel, The Reformatory, is astonishing. Victor LaValle, his novel Lone Women, a kind of a weird horror western featuring the protagonist, an African-American woman living on the frontier in Montana. There's, we could spend like just a whole podcast just listing names, and in terms of films, geez, I would say get a subscription to Shudder, which I think is one of the great investments that you can make right now, because they curate so much interesting material. And there's been so much fabulous material of horror films, let's say, that have come out of Japan or come out of Korea, South Korea especially. A film from a few years back called The Wailing, which I just think is marvelous. And I was thinking about it the other night, thinking I really need to watch that again, because that's just terrific. So yeah, no shortage of things to read and watch.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you the question, and off the top of your head, I think you just mentioned so many incredible people working in the industry, writing stuff. Eric LaRocca, Stephen Graham Jones. I don't know. Do they sleep? It's unclear, because it just feels like every other week they're putting something out that's.
Well, Stephen talked about that at one point, in some interview or another. He talked about having decided at a certain point in his life that he could get by, when he was younger, that he could get by with, like, say, 6 hours of sleep a night. And if he got 6 hours of sleep, he could use that extra 2 hours to write. And more recently, he said he's kind of slowed down a little bit, but even so, I mean, the Angel of Indian Lake trilogy with I Was a Teenage Slasher appended as a kind of, I don't know, like an appendix, I guess. That's an amazing accomplishment. Like, if he had only written those 4 books, it would still be amazing. But on top of that, you've got The Only Good Indians and so on. I mean, not to mention a ton of insane short stories. So yeah, it's, sometimes you look up and you kind of realize, oh man, we're living at the same time as this great writer, and that's really exciting.
The one thing, we got to talk to him a little bit, and the fact that he had to give up basketball because he kept getting hurt, that was a tragedy for me. I love basketball. Thank you so much for your insight here. I love just hearing, you kind of ask these questions and you just know people that, like you, just get joy, right? It's joy out of horror, out of reading, writing, but just kind of doing it alongside these people. For me, this is an incredible joy, and I just appreciate that, your enthusiasm, and of course your words and your worlds. So John, thank you so much for joining us today. This was an incredible time with you. Personally, I'm glad Jeff wasn't here. I got to have a little bit more time. So that's not true, Jeff.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was incredible. Thank you so much. And when your novel comes out with Word Horde next time, hope we have you back. But for now, y'all,
absolutely,
August 5th, if you can, you should pick up Lost in the Dark. It's really incredible. Definitely worth the read. So, John, thank you again. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.